Now back to the question I asked you before, just why on earth would someone steal art in the first place? And also, what is the profile of an art thief? You see who that is? That's Antonio de Cortes, the Prince of Comedy in Italy, one of my favorites. I had to throw that in there. Is it a guy like this, or is it like this? First book I read where the author actually tried to make a psychological profile of an art thief and describe one was Art Stealers. It was written in 1966 by Milton Esterol. He was an interesting man. He was the editor of Art News for years. It was an interesting attempt. It went over everything from jealousy among artists. I'm jealous, I steal your work, to revenge, to greed. You cannot make a profile of an art thief. While many would jump to the conclusion that this type of thief is very sophisticated with a high aesthetic taste and understanding of love, a love of art, understanding of art, it usually isn't the case. Like I said earlier, money is what propels people to steal art, and it's the main motive. Criminals come in all shapes and sizes, and they want money usually. While some may be very sophisticated and intelligent, most are really dumb. In the case of the Victoria, and I'm speaking from experience, in the case of the Picasso in Victoria, Australia, that motive was ideological, right? They wanted funding for the arts. But it's so interesting to see why did they do what they do. There was a guy, Rottweiser, who stole. He was almost like, people say you're a kleptomaniac. He stole hundreds of works from museums just to have his own collection. It's rare, but he was a waiter, went around Europe stealing works. You have many films that depict gentlemen art thieves like Pierce Brosnan in the Thomas Crown Affair. Well-made film, very entertaining. He's one of the greatest, right? He loved art, he was successful, he was highly intelligent and dapper, had his own jet, right? But again, sophisticated criminals, most are dumb, Or you can't jump to conclusions though, because you really can't get your make on them, and you gotta just approach each one like maybe they are smart. This is Vincent Perugia, the man who stole the Mona Lisa, La Gioconda, the Mona Lisa back in 1911 from the Louvre in Paris. Just to jump ahead a little, to play into that dumb thing, they thought he was dumb. He's this young country guy from Italy, now he's in Paris, right, with the big shots. So the police actually interviewed him and wrote him off as too dumb to steal the Mona Lisa. They were looking for a Pierce Brosnan type. They thought, who would steal the Mona Lisa? And they cleared him, and he went back to Italy. So no one can really pinpoint why he stole the Mona Lisa. I mean, it's really a great story. It's a zany story. It hints at all of them. Ideology, nationalism, patriotism, revenge, because he didn't like the French. Many other possible motives. Although when you get down to the bottom of it, it probably was money. He was after some letters he wrote. His father was, Dad, I'm coming back a success. I got money for the family, and he wanted money. It's an old classic theft, over 100 years old. But I want to tell it because it covers all the bases of possible motives and reasons people steal art. And it was the first daring art theft of the 20th century that shocked the world. So this is an awesome painting. Da Vinci painted, I can see why Vincenzo wanted it, because I wouldn't mind having it either. Da Vinci painted this in 1506. He worked on it until 1517. He carried this with him everywhere he went. He loved it so much, it was so dear to him, he left it in his will to his most trusted companion and apprentice, Salai. He lived his life out and ended it in France and his last years. And in the end, he sold this to the King of France, legitimately sold it to King Francis I. It hung in the Louvre since 1797, so definitely the legitimate purchase and property of France. This is my drawing of Perugia. I did it in fingerprint ink on fingerprint FBI card. I like the drawing fingerprint ink. A year before the theft, a woman suffrage activist slashed an Ang painting. It was the Pope Paul VII in the Sistine Chapel. It was on loan to the Louvre, and she slashed it in protest for women's suffrage. A letter was sent right after that vandalism, threatening to harm the Mona Lisa and other paintings. So the Louvre hired a firm, a glazier firm called Corbière, to encase many of the artworks they thought there was a threat of in wood and glass that'll protective cover. It took 3 months to do this. Perugia worked for Corbière. So he got the case to place every day for 3 months. He got the inside, he got to know the place really well. Vincenzo was a sensitive man. You gotta love this guy. Everyone did back in Italy. He was a sensitive man. He offended easy. He resented his French co-workers because they looked down on him. They were biased against Italians. He wasn't smart. We're from Paris. He's from Italy. They called him Mangia Macaroni, which means macaroni eater. And when he wasn't looking, they'd play tricks on him. He'd leave his wine down. They'd put salt in it, right? So there's the revenge motive, right? So he gets it in his head. Months after they were done working there, he gets it in his head, I'm going into the Louvre and stealing back the Mona Lisa that he swore Napoleon looted from Italy. One day on a Monday, because the place is closed on Monday to visitors, only workers, he puts on a worker smock, mixes in with the crowd of workers, and waltzes in like he owned the place. Goes right to the wall, takes it off the wall, and goes out the side door. That was missing for 26 hours before they realized it wasn't there. A guy came the next day who had an appointment. He scheduled it. He was going to set up an easel and paint the Mona Lisa, paint in front of the Mona Lisa. And he went to the guard. Where is she? And where is she? Ding, 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 ding. And alarm bells go off. The security at the time, and no one thought someone would steal something like that. It wasn't believable to them back then. The security at the time was really poor. They had 1,000 rooms over 45 acres, 150 guards to guard 250,000 artworks. And they were more concerned at that moment about vandalism than they were because of what just recently happened. So he kept the Mona Lisa in his little tiny room for 3 years under his bed. And I can imagine him taking the Mona Lisa out, putting her up, and laying on the bed playing her mandolin for her. It's exactly what he did. He played the mandolin, he was in love, you know? So then, he eventually made a false bottom in the trunk, put her in it, and took her back to Italy, right? And he gets to Florence, and he calls a gallery owner. And he says, I have her. I brought her back from it to where she belongs from those like kidnappers, the way he talked, but I want money for her, right? So now he wants money. So he says, come on in. And he calls Giovanni Poggi, who was the director of the Uffizi. And they meet him. As soon as they looked at it, they knew it was authentic. He said, we have it. And they convinced him, he was a little simple-minded, trusting. They convinced him, leave it here so we can examine it further, and we'll get the money for you. Come back tomorrow. They set up a sting, and the Carabinieri, arrested him the next day. The painting was exhibited, once they recovered it, in several cities in Italy. And hordes of people, big crowds of Italians went. She was a rock star. Everyone went to see the Mona Lisa before they sent her back to France. And a lot didn't want her to go back. She became popular. This is when they actually gave it back to the French. So Perugia claimed he believed Napoleon Bonaparte looted that painting from Italy. That was his defense in trial. He was a patriot, a patriot who was returning her back to her motherland, right, to Italy, where she belongs. Napoleon looted her. Napoleon actually did loot a lot of work from Italy. Well over 600 significant artworks, and only 50% were brought back. Interestingly enough, Italy wasn't unified yet. After the Battle of Waterloo, Britain, a few places helped Italy, the regions, get artworks back, especially the Vatican. The Vatican sent the sculptor Antonio Canova to be the ambassador. They started what was called cultural diplomacy early. They managed to get 50% of the works back, but they just refused. To this day, they have many works that belong to Italy, including Veronese's Wedding at Cana. So the Mona Lisa really belonged to France, but he was right about one thing. The looting did occur. The Mona Lisa today, it wasn't the fact when he stole it, but she is in the same room, the Salon d'État, that with this painting facing each other. And that's a very large painting, the largest one that was looted from Italy. Perugia became a little bit of a folk hero because people bought into his story that he was this eccentric patriot who was stealing Mona Lisa to bring her back, even though the authorities really believed he was doing that for the cash. He only did 1 year, 15 days in prison because he became very popular, and he did it in Italy. They never sent him back to France. So we'll go on to the Gardner Museum at 1:38 a.m. on March 18, 1990. As the St. Patrick's Day celebration was still going strong in the bars, because for this holiday in Boston, that night's still young. And remember, the Boston PD, that's one of their busiest nights, you know, is St. Patrick's Day. Two men in Boston police uniforms knocked on the 2 Palace Road door of the Isabella Store Gardner Museum in Boston. Dressed as Boston PD, the security guard sees the cops at the door through the camera. So when the 2 guys dressed as Boston PD knocked on the door, the security guard asked them what they needed, and he said, they told him, we have a call of a disturbance inside this building, we have to investigate. This is a sketch done by the police sketch artist of the 2 suspects. They were wearing false mustaches, so they did it 2 times, one with the mustache, one without. I, out of fun, did 2 myself and fingerprinting on police print card. This is the 2 Palace Road door in Boston that they entered. This is me with the director of security, Anthony Amore. This door no longer exists. They made some changes to the museum. The guard did not follow museum security protocol. He was supposed to, by rules and regulations, tell them kindly, respectfully, okay, sir, wait, call Boston Police Desk, ask them, did you dispatch 2 officers to my museum? Instead, there's 2 doors, a catch door. He buzzes them in the one door, they enter, he buzzes them in the next door and lets them in. Totally disregarding protocol. And security was really poor in this museum at the time. It wasn't a museum that was doing well. Now it's doing really well and has good security. They did have surveillance cameras that went to a VHS tape, old school. They had motion detectors, and the guard had 1 button under his desk, because there were 2 guards always, one that did rounds and one that sat at the desk, and they took turns. That button went directly to Boston Police Department. The one guard, his name was Rick Abath. His partner was Randy. They walk in, they said, where's your partner? He's doing his rounds. Call him down. Randy comes down. They look at Rick. You look like a guy we know has a warrant. Come out from behind the desk, which he did, leaving his panic button, alarm button alone by, getting away from the button, his last hope, his worst mistake of his life. They handcuff them both. They take them way down into the basement, apparently knowing the way. So they knew the whole layout of the place, because it wasn't easy getting from the first floor to where they had to go to get in the basement. They handcuffed them to the pipes a little far from each other and duct taped them up real nice and artistically, as you can see here. And they spent that all night like that till they were relieved the next morning. The thieves then went back upstairs and spent 81 minutes stealing art. Now, 81 minutes is a long time for someone committing a crime, and they're facing all kinds of heavy charges. That's a kidnapping, because they moved them and tied them up. Kidnapping, conspiracy, burglary, grand, theft, like big. But they were so calm, cold as ice. These were professional criminals that had no fear. They had the place to themselves. At that point, they owned it. They went to the Dutch room on the 2nd floor and stole several wonderful pieces of artwork. This is the Storm on the Sea of Galilee by Rembrandt, very large painting. It is oil on canvas. This is 1633 that was done. This is Lady and the Gentleman in Black, also very large, from the same wall, oil on canvas, Rembrandt. This little etching is the size of a postage stamp, done by Rembrandt. They stole that. It's only 1 inch 1 3/4 inch and 1 15 over 16 inch, and it had a frame. And instead of just taking the whole thing and putting it in their pocket, the guy took the time to take it all out of the frame. He took a lot of time to take that out of the frame. This is one I did in fingerprint ink on an FBI card. This Rembrandt, young man at 23, it's on an oak panel. They took that off the wall, but decided not to steal it. Maybe they were getting tired, because there's a lot of work they were cutting in 81 minutes and your hand gives out. But fortunately, they left that one leaning against the wall. It would have just added to the tragedy, a 3rd or a 4th Rembrandt if you count the etching. From the same room, they stole this Govart Flink, Obelisk on a Landscape, that once was attributed to Rembrandt, but maybe they thought it was a Rembrandt unless they just liked it. This piece I really love. It's a Chinese gu, the oldest item in the museum. It's from Shang Dynasty, 12th century bronze Chinese gu. It was used for drinking wine in rituals. They really wanted this piece, the oddball of the whole Dutch room. but it was secured to the desk, and it took a long time to get it unsecured, but they really wanted this piece. This is enhanced what it would have looked like when it was newer. This was the most expensive and one of the most magnificent pieces that was stolen, but the storm is pretty magnificent too. This is Vermeer's The Concert, and it is also on canvas. There's only 35 or 36 Vermeers in the world, depending on who you listen to. They believe he only painted in the upper 40s, like maybe 46. So that's the haul from the Dutch room. And just that Dutch room haul alone would have been considered the masterful heist of the century. But they lost a lot of respect and got a lot of second guessing, especially in the press, for their common sense and ability, because one of them left the Dutch room and went to the short gallery on the 3rd floor, passing Botticelli's, passing some small works that would have been easy to steal, but there was in the same room that he stole 4 Degas drawings, there was a Michelangelo drawing, which would have been worth a lot of money. I believe it's the only Michelangelo drawing in New England, at least. So you did steal a Vermeer and 2 Rembrandts, but then they start really bashing them, their intelligence, for stealing these. They stole 3 mounted jockeys, chalk on paper, procession on the road to Florence. This is a study for a program. What did they want that for? I don't know. Leaving the paddock, a watercolor. And like I said, the value compared to what they could have stole just doesn't compare, and it threw some investigators and the press off. They also stole this gold, bronze gilded finial. The crook who entered this room wanted that flag. It was the 1st Regiment of Grenadiers of Foot, Napoleon's Imperial Guard flag, but it was in a case with protective glass covering. He was taking the time to unscrew all of the screws of that case, and then he got tired and he settled for that. But in the dark, it probably looked like gold. He probably thought he could melt that down. It is worth something because it's from 1813, but in reality, you stole that, you know. But he probably thought it was gold and could melt it down. This is the frame that held the Vermeer. That was one of the Rembrandts. The goo is on that table right there. And the Gobart Flink was on the other side of this. Again, the frame of one of the Rembrandts. Now they famously hang the empty frames where the stolen paintings once hung. They're going to leave them that way until they recover them one day, God willing. So the major haul from the Dutch room appears to be what they were sent there for. The drawings were obviously for a little cash for themselves. There's always an explanation of these things if you look at it with common sense and realistically. You cannot sell masterworks once you steal them. You can't sell a Rembrandt, you can't sell a Vermeer. But in pre-internet 1990s, you could sell those couple drawings. You know, you hop over to Amsterdam or Japan or Australia and someone sees it, knows it's real by looking at it. So there's always a reason for everything. You got to get inside their heads. That's one thing Bobby taught me. You wanna beat them at their game, you got to think like them. You got to learn to think like them. And there's a reason for everything. These guys were hardened criminals. They didn't know how to handle art. I mean, they used the finesse of a barbarian brute on these. They cut the 2 large Rembrandts from the frames, from the stretcher bars, just cut them. So those are so damaged that if they ever get recovered, it's going to be hard to restore them, and they're going to be in the conservation department for decades before they can exhibit them again. It's going to take a lot of work because it's a slow process. And another point with the frames, they thought there were trackers in those frames. They thought there was like a GPS kind of tracking device, so they took all the time to take that little etching out of that frame instead of putting it in his pocket. The frames would get us busted. Maybe that could be done today. It would cost a lot of money to have that kind of tracker that goes past so many feet outside of the museum. But it could be done, we know. But back then, I think they watched too many James Bond movies. But they did take the time to take that one little one out of the frame. They took them all out of the frames, even the Gobart Flink and the Vermeer. But the 2 got damaged. So when they were finished, they go right down to the basement. They checked on the guys a couple times. They didn't want them to get hurt or die because he saw the way they taped them up. You know, like, kid, you still breathing? So they were concerned about them. They went down one last time to check on them, see if they can breathe. they took their driver's license and they told them, behave yourself, don't give up too much, or we're coming back to hurt you. They also said, if you behave yourself and don't talk too much, because they saw their faces, they said, we'll reward you one day. They did say one thing. They said, tell them they'll be hearing from us, which makes people think they might have thought that these works were insured, and they had no insurance on any of the artworks in that museum. The museum wasn't doing well back then. They never heard from them. So as they were leaving, they took the VHS tape, which eliminated the opportunity for the investigators to watch how they work, to watch them at work. They took the tape to the motion detectors, right? But they didn't know, but that downloaded onto a hard drive, so we know all of their movements throughout the building. And that's very interesting to see how they went to the Dutch room. I went to the short gallery upstairs. Now somebody took an Eduardo Manet, the Che Tortoni, beautiful little painting. And I love Manet, he's awesome. The only problem is with this, that was on the first floor in the blue room. The only problem is that we see the motion detectors, those criminals never entered that blue room that entire night. The only person that entered the blue room was about a little after midnight. Rick Bass, the guy who buzzed them in without pushing the button or calling he was the one that walked through the blue room right after midnight. The only one that entered that room that night before the criminals entered, the only ones that entered was Rick Bass. So the FBI, and the frame of that was found on the security chief's desk, right on his chair, next to his desk, next to where they stored a VHS tape. So the criminals didn't take it, but who left it? They did take the VHS tape, so they would have, I would think, see the frame there. The FBI did question him thoroughly a few times, and they never charged him with anything. This is my version of the Che Tortoni on a fingerprint card. I was honored that Ulrich Bolzer put that in his book, The Gardner Heist, HarperCollins. And that was a nice, thrilling thing for me as an artist. Now, once again, this lecture is the first in a series, and it will heat up and get good in each one. The robbery at the Isabella Store Gardner Museum will get a lecture dedicated just to it. It's big. It's 33 years and many colorful characters. I will delve deeper into the details of the nuances of the case and introduce you to many of those colorful characters that have been investigated in it, like Whitey Bulger. This is interesting. It's him in 53, him as a middle-aged man, and him in his 80s. He passed info to the FBI on his rivals, the patriarchal crime family in Boston. It's really interesting that he was working them, giving them info. They were moving up in the office as hotshots, busting all the Italians. And then one FBI agent gave him info about an informant, and he had him killed. That FBI agent ended up going to prison for that. But he also tipped him off about a raid on his house. They were going to arrest him, and he went on the lam for 16 years before he ended up getting back. But he ended up knowing nothing about the art. And he ended up getting murdered at 89 in a Virginia federal holding tank because one of the patriarchal Genovese crime, Freddy Fotios Geas, he was a Genovese associate and hitman, had the opportunity of walking past him, and he brutally beat him to death at age 89. So those old rivalries never end, They and when the crime first occurred, they had so much going on in that underworld of Boston, and it was an interesting underworld. It was an interesting city of neighborhoods. People were loyal to their neighborhoods. You had Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang, the Irish in the Irish South End, the south side of Boston. You had a Charleston Irish mob too in Charleston. You had the patriarchal crime family, which was the big guy on the block in the North End, the Italians. They were looking at all these different organized crime groups and gangs, and they also were considering the Irish Republican Army, who got support from South Boston. And they were known to steal Vermeers and Rembrandts and Gainsborough. So they're and Goyas. They have stolen these paintings in the past and used them as get-out-of-free jail cards. So there was a lot going on between who did this, who pulled it off, and it had to be these big guys, right? Either the IRA or the Irish mob, or this is Vinny the Animal Ferrara. He was a lieutenant he's from the North End a native, and he was a lieutenant in the patriarchal crime family. This is Carmelo Merlino. So over the years, many reporters and documentarians have discussed this 33-year-old cold case in which 500 million or more in art got stolen, and nothing was ever recovered. They tend to stick with the one story with all this that happened from 90 to 2013, but they tend to stick with post-2013 belief after a FBI came out with a news conference. The special agent in charge of the Boston FBI office said they solved the case, they know who committed the burglary initially, they're all dead. They refused to give the names, but they led the public to believe for years leading up to that it was this group. Carmelo Merlino had an auto shop called TRC Auto, and the whole gang of them, of the colorful characters of the Italian mob, were in and out of that place all the time. Now, Ulrich Bolzer in his book laid his money on these two guys, Reisfelder and Turner. They ended up going to prison with Merlino for doing a serious armored car job where he brought a hand grenade and they did years. He just got out. This one's dead. He died with a needle in his arm. But now Bolzer laid all his money on this. A lot of people still believe it was Reisfelder, but many people believe that it was that TRC Auto that was the hub. And you can see, though, that why because they kind of look like the sketches. There's Reisfelder in that one sketch, and Turner, so he kind of looks like him, but they're talking less about Turner now. Since then, they concentrate totally on the Italian mob. No more IRA, no more Corsicans, no more, Irish mob. So if you remember, I discussed Bobby Donati, who was loyal to the patriarchal lieutenant, Vinny the Animal Ferrara. He ended up being his driver, and Ferrara was like his mentor, taking him under his wing. Bobby Guarente, here's the animal again getting arrested. Here's Guarente, Bobby Guarente, a lot of Bobbies. Bobby Guarente was also really close to Vinny the Animal. You gotta love these nicknames, right? Like Henry the Rooster, I don't know. So this is Bobby the Cook. Bobby the Cook, Gentile or Gentile, but everyone's calling him Gentile these days. So Bobby the Cook, who lived in Connecticut, was a New Englander, but was made in the Philadelphia mob. The whole crew of them ended up in the Philly mob. Philly was close to the patriarchal crime family. There was a connection there. And he was really good friends with Guarente. So the Boston FBI office believes these guys, especially the Cook and Guarente, had the two Rembrandts. And they believe that they went from Massachusetts to Connecticut and then ended up here in our neighborhood, not too far in Philadelphia, under the control of the Philly mob. That's the FBI's, or what they're leading people to believe, because they don't confirm anything because it's an active case. So the reporters grab this and run with it. Now, many of the nuances from the early days of the investigation are not discussed as much anymore. Like the paint sample that surfaced back in 1997, which I'm going to briefly discuss now. When the crime first occurred, the authorities immediately trained their sights on several known art thieves, professional art thieves. There's not that many out there, but there's some that are. One of the main men of interest was Miles Connors. I did this portrait of him. And Miles pulled off over 30 art heists in his life. He was known to steal art, and he's a career criminal through and through, and he's proud of his outlaw status to this day. He's proud. I'm an outlaw, right? And his father was a really honest, great sergeant, right, of the police, and I think the brother was a cop, and he might even had a priest, and he said, I don't know where they went wrong, But now I just mentioned Bobby Donati. That's him as a young man. This is him when he was a little older. If he pulled off the Gardner Heist, he would have been about 50 in 1990. Bobby Donati and Connors was really close friends, it turns out. So I mentioned Bobby Donati. He was friends with Vinny the Animal, but then it turns out he's really close friends with Connor. He planned to pull off a heist at the Woolworth estate in Maine. And there was a whole bunch of, they stole 5 NC and Andrew Wyeth paintings from that Woolworth estate in Maine. I think a nice big beautiful grandfather clock. And he brought along Connors, his good friend, because he said, you know, he was the brains of the outfit, but Connors knew the art underworld, and he was expected to fence those items. Problem was, when he tried to sell the paintings, it was an undercover FBI agent. So Connors got pinched for this job, right? 5 Andrew Wyeth paintings, and was facing heavy charges. Donati never got implicated here. So in 1975, when he was facing big charges as a repeat offender, this Rembrandt, young girl in a gold-trimmed cloak, got stolen off the wall in Boston Fine Arts, which is really close to the Gardner Museum. A bunch of guys run into the building, take it off the wall, start running out. Door and open in hours. The guards start chasing them. They pull out a little machine pistol, shot it at their feet down in the steps. So they all had to step back. One tough, retired old Boston PD, old Polish-American guy, old retired guy, a cop is a cop is a cop is a cop. I think Stein said that, and he said, you're not stealing that, I might beat guns or no guns. And he ran right after him in the van, grabbed their leg, and wasn't letting him go, and they took the gun and hit him in the head instead of shooting him, and he fell down with a broken head. And they got away with this Rembrandt, and shortly after that, a mob lawyer named Marty Leppo, who represented Miles Connor, calls up and says, Miles can help you facilitate the return of that Rembrandt, but he wants his Woolworth burglary charges dropped, you know. So they didn't drop the charges, but they reduced the charges, and they were directed to an apartment where they found the Rembrandt under a bed with a note on it saying, kindly return to Massachusetts State Police. Now, the authorities denied reducing his charges for the Rembrandt, but everybody knew that's what happened, especially in the underworld. So criminals all over New England now had it in their head, I steal a Rembrandt, I get you out of jail, right? So Miles Connors has a story. He claims that he gave Bobby Donati the idea for the Gardner. Gardner was a really soft target. Poor security, so much artworks, they could steal anything they want. A lot of people cased the Gardner, according to many criminals. He claims him and Donati cased the Gardner in the 80s, but put it off for a rainy day. And then he ended up going on some drug charges. In 1990, Connors was in prison. So he had an alibi when the Gardner happened. But Bobby Donati, he claims, pulled off the heist because Vinny the Animal Ferrara was facing decades in prison on a 57-count RICO charge. 57 counts of RICO for everything from extortion to kidnapping to murder, right? So he was facing life, and so was the whole crew. Then it was dangerous because now there was a mob war going on in the North End, and without their leader on the road, the rest of the crew was going to get killed, and they knew it. And they were loyal to him. They were very loyal to the Animal. So he claims that Donati pulled off the job so that he can help get Vinny off of his charges the way Miles got out of his charges. You know, I steal a Rembrandt, I got out on my charges. Donati can't confirm this or deny it or tell us anything because the year after the Gardner heist, they found him in the trunk of his Cadillac with 20 stab wounds and his throat cut so bad that he was almost decapitated. Now, this is Miles Connor holding his 17th century samurai sword. He likes to collect swords and all kinds. He has a big collection. He let me hold that sword. I actually got to hold it unsheathed, you know. But privileges come with being an artist. You know, how many people get to hold Miles Connor's 17th century samurai sword and in his residence as well? He lives in Blackstone, Massachusetts, but he posed for portraits for me. And it's interesting to listen to his stories of art theft firsthand. You know, you want to think like him, you know, you got to know how they think. Now, he had a partner, William Youngworth. They're not friends anymore. In 1997, this is William Youngworth III. This is a reporter named Tom Mashburg. He was at the Boston Herald. In 1997, and I'm going to condense now, but we will have a Gardner lecture because I promised to keep this at an hour. Otherwise, you're going to put me in the trunk like Donati. So, and this antiques dealer, William P. Youngworth, entered into negotiations with the museum leadership and the FBI. So he was negotiating the return of artworks. Tom Mashburg got wind he might have had something, and he started pressing him for info, and he started writing articles about him. He called this technique smoking out. It doesn't matter if the articles are true or false. Just write articles. He's got to come out and talk to me eventually to get me to stop. He did. He contacted him and he said, okay, he figured maybe these stories will help us negotiate the return of these things. So one day, Mashburg was snatched off the street in Boston and taken on a long ride to a Brooklyn warehouse where he claims he saw the storm on the Sea of Galilee, and the next day, that was the headline in the Boston Herald, and that became international news. That was the shot heard around the world. Youngworth said he can help get back the paintings, but he wanted the $5 million reward that was being offered. He wanted to be granted total blanket immunity, which they really don't give, but he wanted. He said, I want total blanket immunity for all crimes that can be connected to this crime. Because it could be anything, murder, kidnapping, there's possession of, and they really weren't going to give that to him, and they didn't, and that's, the main stickler was the immunity. They weren't going to give it to him, and he wasn't doing anything without that immunity, but they also wanted the $5 million, and the third demand was, I want Miles Connors out of prison. So, bing, 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 in their heads, the authorities are saying, is Miles at it again? Another Rembrandt gets stolen, and they're trying to get him out of prison. The FBI didn't think that was good enough, and they said, we need proof of life. We need to know you're not conning us. Well, why would I con you, and how can I con you? I can't get the $5 million. I don't need immunity if it's all a fraud, but they were playing a cat and mouse game. They said, bring in a drawing, bring in something smaller, and then we'll negotiate. To get immunity, you really have to prove you're guilty, admit you're guilty, then you negotiate for immunity or not, and they decide whether they give it to you, and they give it to you limited. He wanted blanket immunity before coming in. He knew if he came in with a piece, then they were going to grab him for possession of stolen property, and he was never getting out. And that's the truth. He wouldn't have got out. They would have squeezed him. And so he refused. This is me and Billy in one of my old art studios. So later in 1997, they wanted proof of life. They got it. An envelope arrived at the Boston Herald that was addressed to Mashburg. Inside the envelope, there was a vial with a small amount of paint chips, a small paint sample, not too intrusive, but anytime you scrape a painting, it damages. But small paint sample, just enough. The guy that did it knew what he was doing, and he took it from the right area of the painting to prove what he was trying to prove. The sample was tested immediately by an expert from Chicago, a very renowned expert, Walter McCrone. He's the expert that tested the Shroud of Turin, years ago. And he came out and said it's unadulterated Rembrandt. He was all excited. Problem was, Billy never said it was from the Rembrandt. Mashburg did. When Mashburg, he actually said, I believe this is probably from the Storm of the Sea of Galilee. It was from the Vermeer, not the Rembrandt. So the FBI jumped on the opportunity in their cat and mouse game and quickly announced that the test showed that those chips bore no relationship to the Storm. The sample was missing varnishes that the Rembrandts, both from 1633, if you remember, had. He used the same varnishes, and that was not in that paint sample. So they weren't from the Rembrandt. So they said the sample may have come from a 17th century Dutch master, but it wasn't from the Gardner's Rembrandts. The FBI jumped on the chance to label him a con man and the whole thing a fraud. All the newspapers grabbed that label and they parroted it, right? And it became the normal story there. Fraud, con man. So 3 months later in 1998, two experts, one was Herman Kuhn, tested that paint sample again. Herman Kuhn was an expert, and he did a whole study on Vermeer's painting techniques. Vermeer's painting techniques and how he painted is very well known. He also did pigment analysis, and he even examined The Concert in 1968 for these studies in the Gardner Museum. So he was an expert who was familiar with the painting, and both those experts confirmed that paint sample was consistent with the Vermeer. So the feds, they didn't want to grant Billy the immunity. They started getting bad blood. They thought he was a wise guy. He thought they were not trusting. and only out to get him. So those negotiations broke down forever, and that ended. And in 2003, the FBI asked the expert's expert to test that sample. His name was Dr. von Sonnenburg, Dr. Hubert von Sonnenburg, who was the renowned expert on Vermeer. He was the chairman of conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he was the leading authority. Here's the paint chips that arrived at the Herald. Here's a magnified photo of what Dr. von Sonnenburg was looking at. He examined the chips to determine the makeup of the composition of the painting. He concluded the sample was a fingerprint match to the Vermeer. He was totally convinced. It would be almost impossible to produce a pigment sample that matched that stolen Vermeer. The mix of the pigments and the chemical elements observed, coupled with the layer structure, make almost a fingerprint, or if you will, a DNA match. When the FBI finally admitted that this was consistent with the Vermeer to paint sample years later, it falls on deaf ears now, because that narrative was already ran with the press. And all the way up until recently, every documentary, every show says they weren't consistent with the Rembrandt, the paint chips fraud. It was a fraud. The news played up Dr. von Sonnenburg's findings that red lake matter was present. This is a special red pigment that Vermeer used and many artists back then used, that was made with a cochineal bug. And it comes out really beautiful, and it's in down here. And this is where the paint sample was taken from, and that's where the red lake matter was. And keep in mind, his painting practice is really well known, but it wasn't just the cochineal finding. There was something more specific that led von Sonnenburg to conclude this sample came from the Vermeer. He told John Borelli, who was the respected director of security at Metropolitan Museum of Art for years, that the chips absolutely came from the concert. He told Borelli there was one cross-section in that paint sample that specifically matched. And Borelli said, when someone like Dr. von Sonnenburg's stature tells you something, you take it as gospel. So Dr. Hubert von Sonnenburg and the other experts tested and declared in their finding that the paint chips were totally consistent with the stolen Vermeer, and the authorities and the museum admin pushed the false hoax narrative anyway. But are those chips relevant today, 27 years later? A couple of years ago, they were doing a documentary about the Gardner, and they got a tip that there were some paintings hidden in the yard in Florida. So in the last episode, because they really didn't have an ending, they tipped the FBI off and they dig up the whole yard. They found an old septic tank. They got nothing. Is that relevant? They went over the years to Japan, France, Ireland, England, Corsica, found nothing. Is that relevant? And then this is Bobby the Cook in his last days suffering in prison because they stuck him there trying to break him. They overraided an old broken down police mob guy's Connecticut house and yard, digging up his yard, and they found nothing. I don't know how relevant that is, right? But at least they didn't find a septic tank. But I have a problem with the Italian mob thing. I just can't imagine Bobby the Cook, because he was famous for cooking for the mob guys. They're all like old and in retirement, and they'd all come over his house and cook and talk about the old days when they were in their heyday. I can't imagine him cooking with a Rembrandt on the wall, talking to his broken down mob guy, police friends, arguing about whether it's sauce or gravy, or sauce, it's gravy or sauce, while it's splatting on the Rembrandt. And not for nothing, all of the Philadelphia Police Department, state police in Pennsylvania, even in the FBI office, some of those Philly compared to the Boston office, but the agents in the FBI office, those mob, the Philly was always in turmoil. The mob was always at war. You know, you had Bruno Scarfo, Stanford getting shot by Merlino, and there were arrests and so many witnesses turning and becoming informants in the witness protection unit. And they never heard a word of art. And all of a sudden, the Boston office is telling us that they made it to Philadelphia and it was Bobby that Cook that brought, I don't know. But I knew Joey Merlino's uncle, Yogi, in my law enforcement days. And I had in-depth conversations with him of the workings of the Philly mob. And I just, knowing them, I just can't imagine that story is true. But that's the story that they're going with. Like I said, the FBI didn't confirm that because it's an active investigation. They put so much out and the press grabbed it, eat it up, and they go with it. but they're definitely not the art-loving types. And I think that the mob guy from an Italian mob would have stolen Michelangelo instead of the Degas. But, so I think the 1997 event and paint sample are very significant. This strong piece of physical evidence was the last proof of life of one of the paintings. 33 years and no proof of life. They don't even know if they exist. But in 1997, they had proof that the Vermeer was still there. Simply starting back from square one in 1997 would be helpful, but unfortunately there's no one left to talk to. But the fact that they got very close to a recovery back then cannot be written out or glossed over in this Gardner robbery history, and it irks me every time they do. So Youngworth was the man standing in the middle in between the Vermeer and the museum admin, and they had an opportunity to recover, the only opportunity they had to recover in 33 years. But they should admit this now. They also should apologize to all involved. I just want to show you real quick. Brian Ross and Jill Rackmill, investigative reporter, ABC Primetime, they were very fair to Youngworth. I painted their paintings. They covered this extensively. They posed for me. So, once again, this lecture is the first in a series that will continue in September and the months to follow. In September. Like the Gardner robbery, we'll be discussing many interesting subjects individually, such as Holocaust art restitution, illicit antiquity recoveries, nexus to terrorism and organized crime, in art crimes, forgery and fraud, money laundering, and my specialization, Italian cultural property protection, to name a few. But I also will be doing one lecture on one of my favorite subjects as well. It's artists who commit crimes. And the list of artists who commit crimes is really long, and some are very hilarious, but some are pretty gruesome. They range from everything from comical to mob-like, thug-like behavior and of extortion and threats, and you know, you get the commission, you give them a threat, I'm gonna kill you, you get a commission in my neighborhood kind of thing. So I started with Maurizio Catalan, who made the banana, so I think it's appropriate that I end with him. This is one of Catalan's artworks titled Frankenheim, one of 3 editions. It's sold in Phillips auction house for $1,200,000. I dutifully made my way there to see it because I just think this is awesome. Maurizio once was at a loss. He was having a show in Amsterdam and he was at a loss for an idea. So the night before the show, he had nothing to show. He goes around the block and burgles the entire contents of another gallery. He took the artwork, he took all the office supplies, all the typewriters and telephones, and he drives around, throws it all in the middle of the room. And I guess it was like mixed media burglary proceeds on floor, you know, kind of description. The next day, and he called it another effing ready-made, like Duchamp's ready-made. And the next day, the police arrived, the victim gallery arrives, the director. They agreed not to press charges. It was comical, it was zany, and he agreed to have a show in their gallery the following year. And they said he could actually show this for a couple days before he returned it. So, before taking a couple questions, I want to just invoke the name of Dr. Herman Fink, who this place is named after, the gallery. He was the dean of this school and a royal member in Salmagundi, and when I was at DuCret, I was a happy-go-lucky, kind of playful, that's putting it lightly, art student. But I liked him a lot, and he liked me. And he walked up to me one day and he said, "You're pissing your life away. Play less, work more, make art," right? And that rung in my head. And I kind of would hope he's looking down saying, as much as I put into art, that he'd be proud of me, you know? And especially that I'm actually addressing you in this very special place that was special to him. And it's always been special to me. It's like home. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you at the next one.